What is the military culture in Taiwan? Like, how do civilians view the military? Like, is it considered, America, the whole thing about, like, thank you for your service? Like, is there that kind of attitude towards the military? I'm asking also because I know in China, the attitude toward the PLA is kind of, you don't want to go into the army unless you have absolutely, essentially no choice. Like, so people don't respect the military.
Yeah, so I would say that the popular cultural attitude towards the military is very similar to what you would find in China. And, that's not surprising. Culturally, this idea that you don't use good iron for nails, you don't use good young men and women to serve in the military. I think that basic challenge, though, is compounded in a few different ways. The first is just unabashedly, the military in Taiwan has an authoritarian legacy. It was a big piece of the authoritarian regime and martial law and enforcing martial law through the 1980s. And so for older Taiwanese, this legacy is still alive and well. And in particular, for those who identify on the pan-green side of the political spectrum, the DPP, this is going to be a real problem and a real reason not to trust the military. I also think at the political level, many of the senior DPP political leaders, because they have so little trust in the military, it also means they have very little exposure to the military. And that, as we could talk about later, makes oversight very difficult. So that's one piece of the problem on top of just the basic cultural, like we shouldn't, serve in the military unless you have no other choice. The other problem, I think, is even among younger Taiwanese, those who would have no living memory of authoritarian rule, there is just this profound sense that the military is a waste of time. And again, that isn't a relic of culture per se. I think it is literally a waste of time because in their lives, right, conscription has been shortened and shortened and shortened, and everybody knows someone who has served. And those who have served, and I actually saw this firsthand when I was training Taiwanese Marines 20-some years ago, the conscript's time is just utterly not valued. And so you'll find conscripts doing things like mowing lawns and painting walls and standing guard duty. What they aren't doing is realistic and rigorous training. Arguably, you probably get more realistic training from Call of Duty than you do from serving 4 and now 12 months in the military.
I heard in some cases they don't even handle guns.
So it sounds like they've at least overcome that problem. But yes, now
okay,
we Washington are applauding them because now their conscripts will fire something like 28 rounds in their tour of service, and that's that's an absurdly low number. Certainly barely enough just to know what end of the weapon the bullet's going to come out of. So the Taiwanese know this. This kind of gets back to the Taiwanese youth, and they're sort of like, let me do everything I possibly can to either avoid military service, or if I have to serve, and this is a big problem too, let me make sure I'm not serving in a combat unit. And so they're doing everything they can to get to a cush desk job. Again, it's not because they're afraid to fight per se, but they're like, listen, if I'm not going to be trained on how to do this, then what I want to do is set myself up for success, do my time, maybe learn a skill or two I can take to the civilian sector and move on with my life.
What is the conscription, like, what is that requirement now in Taiwan? You said it's 12 months?
So they are transitioning, and that's the key operative word. So up until 2022, it had been reduced to 4 months. So a long time ago, it was like 2 years, and they slowly reduced it, especially in the Ma years. And then in the last few years, it had been 4 months. And everyone recognized that was just grossly insufficient to do any sort of realistic training. In December of 2022, President Tsai made this big, much heralded announcement that they're going to move to 1-year conscription. But the key is that was going to be a gradual transition. And so right now it's a mixed force. There are some number of the majority of people who still are conscripted, who still serve for 4 months. There is a small percentage who have begun the 1-year tour of service. And right now, I think this year that's about 9,000. But the full 1-year scheme, in other words, everybody who's going to be conscripted is going to serve for a full year. That's not going to actually come to full speed until I think 2029. So by 2029, everybody who's conscripted will serve 12 months.
And what percentage of the Taiwanese population gets conscripted?
So right now it is supposed to be all young men born, I forget after what year they would be eligible for this. And after 2029, everyone who is conscripted will be serving the year. I don't know the percentages in terms of those who are eligible versus those who actually wind up serving. I do know it is fairly easy to either find a way to get an exemption from service, either because you need to go to school or you have flat feet or something along those lines, or even if you are conscripted, to make sure that you manage to find your way into a non-combat unit military.
It sounds to me like there are several other Asian countries that have much more rigorous conscription, like South Korea or even Singapore, that are not directly facing a threat from the Chinese Communist Party the same way that Taiwan is.
Yeah, and I think this comes back to one of these puzzles that we can only solve by looking to political leadership. Because again, Taiwan is, I think, unambiguously, we can debate about the date of an invasion or if an invasion will occur, but unambiguously faces a greater threat than probably South Korea, Singapore, or any of the other countries that have more rigorous training and conscription schemes. And yet, just the response has been so blasé. So, yeah, so what? Show me something I didn't already know. And again, I don't think we can solve that problem without really putting pressure on the political class to make the change, both in terms of pushing for change on top of the Ministry of National Defense, but also in alerting the Taiwanese people that this threat really it's serious.
What is the civilian gun culture in Taiwan?
Somewhere approximating zero. So I live in Texas. I once wrote in an op-ed, Taiwan is no Texas, and there are probably more guns in my neighborhood than there are in the entire island of. So that, again, one of the things that worries me is that after the war in Ukraine, we see a lot of these civil defense efforts pop up. And of course, the media in Taiwan really wants to report back on stories that Washington wants to see, read, click on. And so one of the big stories is, of course, these civil defense things are taking root and really people are energetic about it. And so, especially after the invasion happens in Ukraine, we see lots of stories with pictures of Taiwanese civilians with firearms. Number one, those aren't firearms. Those are airsoft BB guns. They're firing little pellets, so not real firearms. Number two, those pictures, it'd be like finding the three people in a park who are training with this thing, taking a picture of it and just focusing in so it looks like there are thousands of people that are doing this, and it's just not the case. So again, there is definitely a vocal and active minority who are taking a lot of these civil defense preparations efforts quite seriously. And people like Enoch Wu, one of my co-authors on that chapter in Boiling Moat, who've really been working for years trying to build up this grassroots support. But it is not the mainstream view. And I think most Taiwanese just kind of look at it. It is kind of weird and quirky that these people are trying to play, Call of Duty, but for real.
Can Taiwanese civilians get guns like the way Americans can?
No. There are quite literally, and I'm sure there are lots of complex reasons, but you cannot as a civilian purchase a firearm. There may be some bizarre exception. There are also no firing ranges. And so this is a double problem. I mean, there are literally no firing ranges for civilians who can't own firearms anyway. But it's also a big problem. There aren't enough ranges, even for the Taiwanese military. And so even if they're starting to ramp up conscription and expand reserve training, they've been running into some real constraints about literally where do you send these people so that they can, put rounds down range.
I mean, that seems like such an easy fix.
If you have the political will, a lot of things become easy when you want to do them.
Well, they should basically just import a bunch of people from Texas.
They could become the kings of Taiwan.
I feel like that might work, but again, I think a lot of these things are not insoluble. They don't take a PhD to figure out. What they do take is a little bit of political willingness to take a little bit of risk and to ask the Taiwanese people to do things they have not yet been asked to do. I think if you ask them and you prepare a realistic way for them to do it, I think the Taiwanese young men and women would be perfectly willing, just like they would in any country that values their democracy and freedom.
I think it's interesting that you bring up this political will thing, because now I'm thinking about Taiwan's COVID response and how they really did this whole of society, like very clear government communication to people about what the risks are and what they wanted the people to do and how people stepped up themselves to contribute to Taiwan's COVID response and how proud they were of their, and it wasn't coercive the way that the response was inside mainland China, where it's like, you will now be locked inside your home. Even though there were like quarantines for people coming in from out of the country and things like that, people seemed much more willing to deal with it because I think the communication from the health ministry was seen as exemplary. So it seems like Taiwan has the ability to communicate to its civilians on this kind of level.
Oh, absolutely. And this is why I keep coming back. It is not about the willpower of the Taiwanese people. And in some ways, I really feel like the political class underestimates what the Taiwanese people are capable of and sort of infantilizes them. And a prime example, so, I was there in July of this year. At the end of the month, we got hit by a typhoon. It's the second time I've been there for a major typhoon. And I will tell you, I can compare the Taiwanese response and resilience in the face of a threat that they were prepared for, which was to really shrug it off and say, we are ready. Nothing surprises us. And then when invariably the flooding and the loss of electrical power happened, like they treated it like it was no big deal and carried on. And I juxtapose that with what happened to Houston, Texas, right before I left, where we got hit by a very small hurricane and it basically brought down the power grid for 5 days, people calling for the governor's head. And so it tells me that this isn't about one culture being superior in the face of adversity to another, but rather it tells me that the Taiwanese people have been mentally and physically prepared for natural disasters. Now it's simply time to take the next step as a political class and say we can also prepare them in order to inoculate them against this sort of invasion threat so that they're ready. The problem would be if they're not ready, if they are caught off guard, if they're caught by surprise. And that's, I think, when you find a society that's willing to give up pretty quickly.
Do you think that it is something that could realistically happen? Like, are there examples of countries or, political classes that are willing to do something like this at a political cost to themselves, like a political cost to the DPP,
Yeah, I mean, so on the political calculus side, it's an interesting question. In terms of have we seen a society galvanize very quickly? Yes, I mean, Ukraine. And that is a classic example that, again, Putin did us a favor in air quotes in that he invaded in 2014. And that was a real wake up call that the threat was real and that Ukraine's existing military apparatus was not ready for something more. And so it kind of had 7 years, but they took the threat seriously. And we see a real societal and military and political reorientation. So I know it can happen. Really, if you look at the history of the United States, we are continuously throughout the last 200 years caught off guard. We are not ready. We get ready quickly. The reason I'm concerned, though, is both in Ukraine's case, where Putin does a favor and does like a half-hearted invasion to start things off years ago, or the U.S., where we're thousands of miles away from any direct threat to the homeland. Taiwan's got 90 miles of standoff distance. And again, I think some of that threat will likely already be on the main island by the time this thing happens. So Taiwan won't have the luxury of time, which is why I think left of boom, way left of boom, preferably 5 years ago, but if not 5 years ago today, I really would like to see Washington twist some arms in Taipei and really get the Taiwanese leaders to start, doing what needs to be done, even if it may cost them an election or two.